If you met a nomadic alien fleet and asked where they were from, you might not get an answer, not because they are hiding it, but because the question itself no longer applies. What happens when a civilization outlives its species, its homeworld, and even its original purpose, but keeps moving anyway? Science fiction has been asking versions of this question for decades, from wandering alien flotillas like the Quarrens in Mass Effect, to the refugee fleets of Battlestar Galactica, to far-older, quieter nomads hinted at in hard science fiction. We tend to imagine nomads as wanderers by choice, people who move because they love movement, who trade stability for freedom, who carry a romantic vision of the open road or open sky. But in science fiction, and in our own history, nomadism rarely begins as a lifestyle preference, far more often as a survival strategy. Alien nomads in fiction are rarely wanderers for wanderers' sake. They are entire species of breakaway cultures, exiles, survivors, traders, or remnants, for whom starving proved more dangerous than leaving. A civilization becomes nomadic when staying put stops working. In low-tech, prehistoric eras, that often meant running out of food to hunt or gather, and nomadism was likely the default state of early humans, but it also happened suddenly to settled societies. When a home, or an entire home world, is lost to war, climate collapse, artificial intelligence rebellion, or some internal disaster that makes return impossible, including exile by one's own kin. It can also happen slowly. Expansion may outpace governance, political unity may fail to keep up with technological reach, or the dangers being found may begin to outweigh the comforts of being settled. In those cases, motion is not a luxury, it's camouflage. If you're new here, I'm Isaac Arthur, and this is Science and Futurism, where alongside near-term science and space topics, we often explore alien civilizations and other science fiction ideas with a bit more room to speculate, a bit more fun, and a bit less fear of saying let's see what happens, while still keeping one foot firmly planted in real science. If you enjoy deep dives like this, consider liking the video or subscribing. It helps more than you might think. And feel free to grab a drink or a snack. We'll be here for a bit. Today we'll discuss this familiar science fiction idea of nomadic aliens roaming the galaxy, asking how realistic it actually is, especially without relying on common tropes like fast and light travel. We'll look at what life in such civilizations might be like, how they survive over deep time, and whether nomadism could one day become the fate, or even the destiny, of some future splinters of humanity. The ship is the world. Once a civilization commits to long-term motion, the meaning of a ship changes. This is the point where many fictional alien fleets stop looking like armadas and start looking like cities, like in the migrant fleet in Mass Effect, the convoy of Battlestar Galactica, or the vast, slow-moving collectives imagined in harder science fiction. And that term can be fairly broad. The aliens of Independence Day franchise are roaming ravagers descending on innocent worlds, as are the Tyranids of Warhammer 40,000. In most stories, ships are vehicles, temporary containers meant to carry people between destinations. But for true nomads, destinations are optional. What matters is duration. Once voyages stretch into decades or centuries, the distinction between a spaceship and a space habitat collapses. At that point, the only reliable way to tell a station from a ship, or a moving fleet from a loose conglomeration of habitats, may be that one side of the ship carries heavier shielding. Propulsion becomes just another utility system, like water recycling or power distribution, and people aboard are no longer traveling through space so much as living within it, while the universe slowly slides past outside. Perhaps a bit like living in an island in the middle of a wide river. Ships probably grow accordingly. I would guess they would accrete layers, modules, and appendages the way new towns or coral reefs grow. Irregular, organic, and often structurally alarming, at least the engineers tasked with keeping them intact. What begins as sleek vessel becomes a drifting archipelago of neighborhoods, workshops, farms, data vaults, and sacred spaces. Some sections are carefully planned, others are barely tolerated improvisations, grandfathered in because removing them would cause more unrest than leaving them in place. Over time, single ships give way to fleets. Specialization emerges naturally. Some vessels focus on manufacturing or repair, others on agriculture, data storage, exploration, or defense. Couriers and tenders move between them, redistributing people and resources. Fleets travel together not because they must, but because separation increases risk. A lone ship is fragile, a fleet is an ecosystem. And like any ecosystem, it develops a governing structure whether it intends to or not. I think most long-lived nomadic fleets would likely converge on some form of navarchy, a political system rooted not in territory or population but in ships themselves. Authority flows from captains rather than citizens, because the ships are irreducible units of survival. You can lose neighborhoods or even entire habitats and endure, lose too many ships and the civilization ends. That reality produces a council of captains dynamic almost by necessity. A fleet may elect a coordinating admiral or maintain a rotating council of commodores, but the rule is unlikely to resemble an absolute monarch or a rigid military commander. Instead, governance tends to look more feudal. Captains function as largely independent barons, while squadron commanders might act as intermediaries in larger fleets, vassals in structure but still highly autonomous. Decisions are negotiated between leaders who each command self-contained worlds, with their own crews, cultures, and leverage. Larger ships or tightly wed squadrons probably carry more political weight, and specialized vessels, manufacturing hubs, agricultural ships, archival ships often wield influence far beyond their crew size. Flagships emerge not because someone planned an empire, but because coordinating demands it, and later tradition maintains it. This also potentially makes fleet politics unusually brittle. There is no hinterland to retreat to, no neutral ground to regroup on, no distant central command to report or complain to. When disagreements become irreconcilable, nomadic civilizations might fight. You could have entire wars on larger ships, but these probably rarely escalate into full civil wars in a fleet. Instead, they split. Entire subfleets peel away, taking ships, people, and institutional memory with them, sometimes rendezvousing centuries later as distant cousins who barely recognize one another. Nomadic civilizations don't just evolve over time, they speciate. Ironically, while nomadic cultures are often started by those seeking new things or change, governance in such nomadic fleets is likely to be tied to tradition and authority, even when the official ideology is not. When you cannot simply leave, when there is no countryside to flee to and no neighboring nation to defect toward, authority becomes difficult to escape. Whether rule is benevolent, oligarchic, or openly authoritarian, it is always backed by the same reality. Space outside the hulls is not forgiving. That does not mean life aboard is uniformly bleak. And I've noted in sci-fi with nomadic aliens or humans, it does tend to tilt to the bleak even beyond whatever crisis and desperation might have forced their lifestyle. Think of modern caravans of retired folks with RVs as an alternative, and we see that these need not be interstellar nomads or megaships. These might be fleets of personal yachts or traders moving around a built-up asteroid belt. A small school of fishes, each their own specialty, converging on a colony like a carnival to be set up. Moreover, nomadic fleets can be extraordinarily advanced, culturally rich, and even comfortable. Virtual environments, artificial nature preserves, and carefully managed ecosystems can support lives as full as any planetary civilization, but everything exists under a shared awareness of finitude. Mass matters, leakage matters, mistakes compound over centuries, and crucially, membership matters. A nomadic civilization does not remain static as it moves. People are born, people die. Ships are lost, ships are gained. Crews merge, split, defect, or are absorbed. A fleet that survives long enough will inevitably encounter others like itself. Refugees, traders, breakaway colonies, failed settlements, and not all those encounters end with a polite exchange of radio signals and a clean separation of trajectories. They could be refugees or pirates or both. Sometimes the only way to survive is that the others are bored. That decision is never just humanitarian, it is political, strategic, and existential. Granting sanctuary means importing not just people, but histories, enemies, and unresolved conflicts. A ship fleeing something does not leave that something behind cleanly. Instead, it brings it with it, encoded in trauma, secrecy, and sometimes deliberate deception. This creates a dilemma unique to nomadic civilizations. Who gets to decide? On a planet, sanctuary is negotiated through institutions that outlast individuals. In a fleet, the decision is immediate and often irreversible. There is no external authority to appeal to, no higher court to consult, and no easy way to undo the choice once a new population is integrated into shared life support systems. Even refusal carries risks. Groups turned away may become pirates, rivals, or future threats who know your routes, your vulnerabilities, and your habits. Or if your fleet is piratic, might run off to inform the local space navy of your whereabouts. The most dangerous cases are the ambiguous ones, ships that arrive with damaged communications, fleets that claim to be refugees but offer technology as inducement, groups that ask not to land anywhere but merely to travel alongside for a while, strength in numbers. Granting sanctuary may save lives, but it may also be the moment a nomadic civilization unknowingly invites its own undoing aboard. Long-lived fleets remember this and may get paranoid. Hospitality becomes ritualized, trust becomes conditional, screening traditions grow elaborate, survival favors generosity, but only when paired with caution. And over enough centuries, the population aboard a nomadic fleet may no longer resemble the population that launched it. Languages drift, cultures hybridize, biology itself may diverge, which leads to the most counterintuitive truth among nomadic aliens. A nomadic civilization is very often not a species at all, it is a group. And once that line is crossed, identity, loyalty, and survival begin to operate by rules that plant-bound civilizations rarely would have to confront. The nomadic group is not the species. Once a civilization has existed in motion long enough, something subtle but profound happens to it. The question of where are we going begins to matter less than who are we allowed to bring along. This is where the familiar idea of nomadic aliens quietly breaks down. We tend to imagine that a nomadic civilization represents an entire species on the move, every surviving member bundled into ships, fleeing together as one people. But that assumption doesn't hold up very well once we stretch the timeline beyond a few generations. Over centuries or millennia, nomadism stops being a species-wide condition and becomes a political and cultural one. Most species don't travel whole, they fracture. Some groups leave early, having already found a new homeland. We see that dynamic in Battlestar Galactica when they find New Caprica. Some leave late, some never leave at all, others are left behind deliberately, cast out, slip away quietly, or peel off after internal conflicts. On interstellar timescales, this isn't a single event, but a drawn-out process spanning tens of thousands of years and dozens of branching moments, just to move a fleet a few thousand light-years, which on a galactic scale is what a few dozen miles are to a continent. A nomadic fleet, then, is rarely a species. It is a subset, sometimes a splinter of culture, sometimes a professional class, sometimes the losing side of a civil war, and maybe sometimes the winning side fleeing the consequences of a scorched earth victory. Inside that splinter are already the forming tribes and factions that will eventually splinter the fleet again. On a mile-long ship of thousands, the families that have been tending the engines develop a different culture than the ones running hydroponics, and both are unlike those running refining and mills on a mining ship cruising alongside them. And consider the starship Voyager from Star Trek on its 70-year journey back to the Alpha Quadrant. Imagine them being composed of many different alien species, what that would have looked like had we seen them for more than 7 seasons, but 7 decades, or even longer. Was the second, third, or 40th generation like on a ship like that? A civilization in motion cannot rely on bloodlines or birthplace as its core identity either, and while that's true of stationary ones too, I think it's amplified here. Children are born aboard ships that no longer resemble the vessels their ancestors launched from. Cultural memory stretches thin, origin myths blur or get rewritten to be more palatable. A child might even realize their grandma's family history of exile was a blend of 2 grandparents of her own that came from different worlds and exiling tragedies. Even in digital eras like ours, accurate long-term history is hardly guaranteed. And eventually, belonging is defined not by ancestry but by participation. You are part of the fleet because you live in it, work in it, and accept its rules. That shift matters enormously because it opens the door to a possibility that science fiction often gestures at but rarely explores deeply. The nomadic group may become multi-species. Not through conquest necessarily, more often through necessity. Rescue operations, absorbed refugee ships, trade crews who never leave, colonies that fail and reattach themselves to the fleet that once seated them, or even cases like Voyager where the crew began that way. And again, over longer timelines, a nomadic civilization will encounter others like itself, displaced, drifting, or simply unwilling to stay put. Kindred souls, maybe. Turning them away may be safer in the short term, but survival in deep time rewards flexibility more than purity. Once biology stops being the admission criterion, culture takes over. Language, shared history, rituals, professional roles. We are all Starfleet first and foremost. And most importantly, missions become the glue that holds the group together. The fleet is no longer defined by what its members are, but by what they do. The institutional memory of the fleet. This idea that the group can outlast its original identity is not unprecedented, even in fiction built around long timelines. One of the clearest metaphors comes not from space opera, but from one of my favorite grimdark fantasy novel series, The Black Company by Glenn Cook, a mercenary institution that persists for centuries, even as its membership, ethnicity, morality, and even its core purpose shift repeatedly. Minor spoilers follow. Across nearly half a millennium of in-story history, the company begins as an invasion force from a mysterious unknown land. It moves into territories resembling the peoples of India, then north into regions evocative of Central Africa, onward into Middle Eastern and Mediterranean analogs, and many more, some drawing more or less on real historical examples, eventually a more classic Western medieval fantasy setting, and finally back again, eventually settling in a region more East Asian in character. Throughout this journey, the company's size fluctuates wildly, shrinking at times to as few as 7 survivors, and others swelling to tens of thousands of soldiers, still commanded by the company captain even when he has subordinate generals. Frequently, large portions of the company do not even speak the same language as their predecessors, because most recruits are drawn from the region where the company currently operates, or most recently passed through. The group's physical appearance, skin tones, customs, and worldview change with every generation. And yet, the Black Company remains recognizable as a single entity long after none of its founders' descendants remain. The institution remembers itself even when the people do not, and indeed is quite obsessed with keeping its archives, the company annals, even though they're often in different languages. I think something similar probably happens in nomadic space civilizations, though for more mundane and far less romantic reasons. Ships and fleets not merely change because of cultural recruitment, but because physics demands it. In theory, a sufficiently closed spaceship might never need to stop and just waste fuel to do so. In practice, it can only go so long before it needs to restock raw materials or carry so many on board that it might as well just keep fuel for stopping and refueling. Hulls degrade, atmospheres leak, machinery wears down. Even a modest, seemingly manageable loss rate compounds brutally over time. A ship losing just 1% of its atmosphere or consumables per year, which is actually a very low leakage rate, will retain only about 36% after a single century, and less than 2% after 3 centuries. No amount of initial provisioning can overcome that math, though bigger ships will leak less proportionally. To survive multi-century journeys, a nomadic vessel must periodically stop, send out faster foraging craft, harvest or purchase local resources. Though those might be bought as they're passing through a system and sent to them at high speed so they didn't have to stop or slow down, assuming they have some way to pay. These are not colony ships that are always stopping in unpopulated regions. They are therefore likely to have people who would like to leave the nomadic life or take on new people who know the local region of space and want to move on, either locals or nomads from some other interstellar ship looking to sign on, or even descendants of some nomad that settled there a couple centuries back. Then it just depends on the culture of the nomads. Some are very unwelcoming to outsiders joining, some actively recruit, and this could shift over time if that fleet was getting low on people or skill sets, or alternatively if they got a bad batch of new members and soured them on recruiting from outsiders. As a result, nomadic fleets might tend to follow a logic remarkably similar to mercenary institutions. Indeed, I dare say some would be mercenaries themselves, or occasionally open to filling that role or engaging in piracy. But a ship might launch from the Jovian system, carrying a specific cultural mission and a very Earth-derived identity, and when it finally reaches a distant star, that Earth culture may survive only as archived records, inherited rituals, and ceremonial language. The living crew may instead be descended from asteroid miners, absorbed refugees, or entire populations that joined along the route. And in other cases, they might actually follow the traditions of their homeworld better than the people still on that homeworld do. Yet they still answer the same navarchy, they still fly under the same flag. Like the Black Company, the fleet becomes a continuous institution, a ship of Theseus on a civilizational scale. Every plank has been replaced, every person has changed, sometimes even the species has shifted, but the mission continues. Nomadic civilizations work the same way. Ships change crews, crews change species, the fleet persists. Accretion, not assimilation. At this point, it's tempting to imagine nomadic civilizations as endlessly absorbing outsiders, slowly dissolving into loose, incoherent patchworks of culture, but that's often not what long-lived nomad groups actually tend to become. They don't assimilate indiscriminately. Accretion is selective. It's cautious. It preserves structure even as it adds mass. A nomadic fleet that survives for centuries learns very quickly that every new addition carries risks. Biological incompatibility, cultural fracture, ideological subversion, espionage, disease. These are not abstract concerns when you're sealed in a finite environment with no external escape routes. As a result, long-lived nomad groups tend to develop extremely strong internal filters. Probably the literal kind for their air, too. You can join, but only if you can function within the system. That might mean adapting to shared environmental standards. It might mean accepting a common legal code, a shared working language, or a rigid occupational hierarchy. It might even mean partial biological modification, cybernetics, genetic tailoring, or digitization to make diverse species compatible within the same habitats. This can be by conquest and assimilation too. The Borg of Star Trek are arguably nomadic, and so are the honored matres of Frank Herbert's Dune, who eventually find out are fleeing a more powerful and alien enemy, but they overrun thousands of worlds and conquer as they flee, and change are all changed in the process. Indeed, they are later shown to be a degenerate offshoot of the hybrid of two earlier factions that fled into space after the fall of the Atreides Empire. But for such peoples, whether kind travelers, wandering mercenary companies, or ruthless conquerors, often what matters is not sameness, but predictability. Identity then is reinforced through narrative. Nomadic groups preserve themselves by telling stories about the founding exodus, about great near disasters survived, and about the ships lost and the routes abandoned. Ritualized remembrance replaces geography. You don't point to a homeland on a map. You point to a moment in history and say, that is when we became us. To cite our Black Company example from earlier, they keep a very detailed record of their work, the annals, and the analyst for the company is not only our main viewpoint character for most books, but is often the unit's prior standard bearer and future commander. That banner and those annals are desperately important to an ever-changing company of rogues and exiles staying unified over centuries and continents. Thus, mission statements can become sacred texts. Some fleets define themselves as gardeners, spreading life wherever they pass. We recently restarted our Unity series following such a gardener-style colonization fleet. In theory, these may be among the simplest nomadic civilizations imaginable. They don't need planets waiting for them, except in the specific sense their core purpose is to eventually stop and settle a new, empty world before moving on again. All they truly require are two things: raw materials and purpose. Raw materials are easy enough, especially at the edge of settled space. Asteroids are plentiful, comets are cheap, and stars are generous with energy. Information from home matters too, and may be the more fragile resource over long timescales. But the real glue holding a gardener fleet together, and the fault line it can eventually break along, is that shared sense of purpose. That's why, when we discuss these concepts, it becomes so important to build in off-ramps and escape hatches. Opportunities for people to leave the fleet, to settle a new planet, to join a different ship or a splinter fleet, even head backward toward a previously settled world. A healthy gardener fleet isn't one that never loses people, it's one designed to expect that loss, and to use as a core mechanism of achieving its goals. In that sense, gardener fleets may be one of the most realistic forms of nomadic civilization. They're not driven by a single grand endpoint so much as by a very human pattern: constant exploration, settlement, and renewal. There will always be volunteers who will remain with the fleet. There will always be others eager to peel off. There will always be internal rivalries, disagreements, and ideological splits that encourage fragmentation. And paradoxically, that's exactly what makes the overall project work. A handful of gardener fleets leaving Earth this millennium could, in aggregate, plausibly settle everything out to the galactic rim, not because they stay unified, but because they don't. Along the way, chunks of their civilization break off. Some settle permanently, others continue nomadic life with a different purpose. Traders, roaming builders, pirates, religious pilgrims traveling toward an Earth tens of thousands of years away. All of that can happen without stopping the original gardener mission. Indeed, it may require it. The fleet advances by dividing, like a hydra growing new heads. And this might be how we first encounter alien civilizations, not as monolithic empires or neatly bounded species, but as spreading, fracturing fleets. Not a single overwhelming force, but many related offshoots, some ancient, some young, some barely recognizable as kin. You might encounter one fragment thousands of years and centuries of drift away from its founding culture, while the core civilization continues to grow far behind it. In that sense, it's rather wonderful. You don't meet an alien civilization all at once. You meet its echoes, its experiments, its pioneers and exiles, its mistakes. Fleets of thousands, millions, or even billions, sometimes peaceful, sometimes dangerous, often contradictory, none of them the whole story on their own. Two nearby fleets are not necessarily closely related either. any more than two twigs touching on a tree necessarily come from the same branch, each continuing their role of branching out and exploring their galaxy. Others might define themselves as traders, bridges between worlds that will never meet directly. Some are pilgrims, moving forever toward a destination that may no longer exist, and some are simply survivors, convinced that stopping is the one thing that would finally kill them. Over time, these missions harden into identity. Children are not raised to return home because home is not a place, it is the fleet itself. Leaving becomes an act of immigration, not arrival. Those who depart to settle worlds are no longer pioneers but expatriates. And this leads to one of the most interesting long-term outcomes of nomadic civilization, the refusal to settle, even when settlement is possible. By the time a fleet can build planets worth of habitat space from raw material, choosing not to stop is no longer about necessity, it's about continuity. The fleet itself has become a moving answer to a question no planet-bound civilization ever has to ask. What are you when motion itself is the only thing holding you together? When nomads stop, and when they refuse to. Every nomadic civilization eventually faces a choice that has been postponing for generations. Do we stop? At first, the question doesn't even feel real. Early fleets are too fragile, too hunted, too uncertain to risk anchoring themselves to a star system. Later fleets often could settle, but doing so would mean dismantling the very structure that keeps them alive. And that's when the debate becomes dangerous. Some nomadic civilizations settle because they succeed. They reach a destination worth risk, a system rich enough to support their population, defensible enough to protect it, and empty enough to avoid immediate conflict. These fleets often fracture on arrival. Some ships remain in orbit, some descend, some leave again almost immediately. What emerges is rarely a single civilization, but several descendants, planetary societies, orbital cultures, and residual nomad groups that keep the old ways. Others settle because they fail. Resource exhaustion, political collapse, internal war, or simple entropy can force a fleet to stop, even would rather keep moving. These settlements tend to mythologize the journey that ended them. The road becomes sacred, motion becomes virtue. Staying put is framed as tragedy, not triumph, of giving up or having no choice. But the most interesting case is a third one. Some fleets do not stop even when they clearly could. By the time a nomadic civilization can dismantle asteroids, build millions of square meters of rotating habitat, and maintain closed ecosystems indefinitely, settlement becomes optional. A planet offers gravity, yes, but also offers borders, neighbors, and permanence. Motion, by contrast, offers control. A fleet that never settles never becomes predictable. It does not need to defend territory, only trajectory. It does not need to govern land, only systems. It does not accumulate borders, only stories. And over deep time, that can be a decisive advantage. Civilizations that stay put power their history in one place. Civilizations that move smear their history across space and time, making it harder to erase. This is why some nomadic cultures might come to view settlement not as an endpoint, but as a kind of death. Stopping means becoming legible to others, means being mapped, categorized, taxed, besieged, or absorbed. Motion preserves ambiguity. Motion preserves autonomy. And for civilizations that survive centuries or millennia by never being in the same place twice, that lesson becomes existential. So the fleet keeps moving, not because it must, because it knows what happens if it doesn't. Today we're looking at civilizations that never settle down, species that wander instead of building permanent homes, because survival doesn't always mean building something that lasts. Sometimes it means staying flexible, adapting, and moving on when conditions change. If you enjoy strange ecosystems and life that already feels alien, check out Gods and Monsters from Curious Archive. It explores deep ocean creatures through a mythological lens, massive, ancient, and often unsettling. It's a reminder that even here on Earth, life can thrive in environments we would struggle to survive in. And if conditions on Earth shifted that dramatically, our monthly exclusive, Surviving a New Ice Age, explores how humanity might adapt when the planet itself becomes far less hospitable. Nebula is where every episode of SFA appears early and ad-free, alongside years of monthly exclusives and content from hundreds of other creators. Right now, Nebula is offering 40% off on lifetime access, just $300 for permanent access to everything on the platform. Use my link or the QR code to get that deal. There's also 50% off an annual plan. That's just $30 for the whole year. The oldest civilizations may be the ones still moving. There's a quiet assumption baked into most discussions of advanced civilizations that age correlates with scale, with power, with rootedness. The older a civilization is, the more infrastructure it should have, the more territory it should control, the more visible it should be. There are good reasons to think that it might not be universal, but nomadic civilizations break the pattern entirely. If survival favors adaptability over dominance, then the longest-lived civilizations in the galaxy may not be the biggest empires, the brightest megastructures. It may instead be the ones that learned very early on that permanence attracts attention, and attention attracts trouble. A civilization that never truly settles never presents a single point of failure. It can lose ships without losing itself, can fragment without collapsing, can change biology, culture, and even identity without experiencing what a planet-bound society would recognize as extinction. Disasters that would annihilate a settled world become localized tragedies rather than existential threats, because the civilization was never entirely there in the first place. Over millions of years, that advantage compounds. One of the most plausible candidates for such ancient nomadic civilizations is not refugees or pilgrims, but interstellar traders. Trade networks naturally incentivize movement, redundancy, and longevity. A merchant civilization does not need to own territory. It needs routes, clients, and time. And in a relativistic universe, time itself becomes a resource you can manage. We see this explored particularly well in Alistair Reynolds' work. In the Revelation Space universe, the Ultras are effectively a nomadic trader civilization, not defined by species or homeworld, but by contracts, ships, and relativistic travel. By moving at near light speed and spending most of their existence in suspended animation or time-dilated flight, they experience only months, while decades pass outside. Empires rise and fall between their trade runs, but the Ultras persist, largely unchanged, because they simply step around history instead of living inside it. A similar idea, dialed up to galactic scales and timelines, appears in Reynolds' House of Suns, where the lines, thousands of cloned individuals sent out across the galaxy, travel on vast looping circuits that begin in just a handful of centuries from now, and initially took centuries, when the novel 6 million years in the future take hundreds of thousands of years to complete each circuit. Each individual experiences a very long lifetime, being effectively immune to aging, but still only a tiny fraction of that 6 million years. They meet once a circuit to exchange memories, most of which they do not store in their own brain. Collectively, the line witnesses galactic history on timescales normally reserved for stars. Civilizations collapse, species vanish, new intelligences arise, the Nomads remain. In both cases, motion is not just geography, it is temporal insulation. By freezing themselves, digitizing, or exploiting relativistic time dilation, nomadic civilizations can survive not only spatial threats, but historical ones. They do not need to outrun disaster, they can simply wait for it to burn itself out. The galaxy becomes something you sample intermittently, like a traveler waking between long sleeps, checking the state of the world, trading, learning, and then moving on again before becoming entangled. Or perhaps you do for a century or two, and then move back on again. Such a duration is tiny compared to that of your voyage. Such civilizations might pass quietly through star systems, harvesting resources, exchanging information, absorbing fragments of other cultures, and then departing without ever fully integrating. They leave behind artifacts, partial records, and contradictory legends. Some worlds remember them as benevolent traders, or even long-term guests, others as pirates, spies, devils, angels, or ghosts. In some systems they may be credited with seeding technologies, and others blamed for collapses they barely remember. All of those stories may be partly true, and if we ever encounter nomadic aliens, that ambiguity may be our first and most important clue. We may discover they do not speak for a species, a homeworld, or an empire at all. They speak for a route, a network, a way of existing that does not anchor itself to planets, borders, or even eras. They may be stopping by simply to learn of us and to refuel a few billion tons of fuel and raw materials from our asteroid belt, or they may mean to conquer and sack our world. We may invite them to stay for a time or ask them to leave, but surely we would ask them where they are from, and they may hesitate to answer, not because they have forgotten, but because the question no longer makes sense to them. For a civilization that has lived in motion long enough, home is not a place you return to. It's not even a place you remember clearly. It's the direction you keep going. And in a universe measured in billions of years and trillions of stars, that may not just be a romantic notion, but the most durable survival strategy of all.